In the modern NBA, having a wing who can defend two and sometimes even three positions is a necessity. Guys like LeBron James, Kawhi Leonard, and Giannis Antetokounmpo, among others, will run rampant if somebody isn't there to impede their progress. Back 10 or 15 years ago, however, that wasn't the case. Having a hulking center setting up in the paint was the move, and teams needed effective counterparts. However, as time wore on, the focus began to shift. When talking about how great a specific athlete is, a lot of the context comes from the time period that they play in. Oftentimes, especially in the NBA, guys will enter the league with a certain skill set that doesn't fit what the focus is at that time. And this happens all throughout NBA history. I could think of a multitude of guys who just were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and their careers suffered to a certain degree, some more than others, because of it. However, someone I thought of for this episode was Andrei Kirilenko, the multifaceted forward who began to rise to prominence with the Utah Jazz at the beginning of the millennium. Born in Russia in 1981, Andrei Kirilenko began his professional basketball career when he was just 15 years old, the time when many of us here in the States are just learning how to drive. His first professional action came with Spartak St. Petersburg of the Russian Basketball Super League, and later on he went to sign on with arguably the best team in the country, CSKA Moscow. Kirilenko's impressive skill set drew the attention of the Utah Jazz, who drafted the then 18-year-old with the 24th overall pick in the 1999 NBA draft. Kirilenko stayed in Russia until the 2001-2002 season, where he sharpened his skills and was later named the MVP of the Russian Basketball Super League in 2000. If it weren't for Manu Ginobili being a member of that very same class, I'd feel comfortable proclaiming Kirilenko as the steal of that year. The Jazz got a 6'9" forward who was a supreme athlete and possessed defensive instincts of someone 10 years his senior. What made it even better was that Kirilenko doubled as a legitimate threat on offense as well. Like most European bigs, Kirilenko possessed a high basketball IQ and was an above-average passer. The majority of his points came off of hustle plays, but for someone who wasn't a ridiculously dynamic scorer, he had a unique knack for getting to the free throw line, sometimes getting 4, 5, 6, or even 7 foul shots per game. Those 5 years of professional basketball in Russia allowed Kirilenko to adapt to the level of athleticism and physicality that he would face upon coming to the NBA, and he emerged as a lockdown defender as a rookie. At the time, he was just the fourth first-year player to accumulate more than 100 blocks and 100 steals in their rookie year, which worked out to averages of 1.9 and 1.4 respectively. Since then, only Nerlens Noel has joined a very exclusive club. What's arguably more impressive than those statistics is the amount of fouls that Kirilenko committed, or should I say the lack thereof. His discipline was extraordinary, and he got whistled for less than 2 personal fouls per game, an extraordinary number for a rookie. That season, the Jazz picked up 44 wins and met the Sacramento Kings in the first round of the playoffs. However, their chances of advancing were very slim, as Sacramento had emerged as one of the elite teams out west, accumulating 61 wins on the shoulders of Chris Webber and Peja Stojakovic. Utah's best players were Karl Malone and John Stockton, but this wasn't the mid-90s anymore. Although the two Hall of Famers were productive, they were approaching 40 and not producing at the level that people were accustomed to from the previous decade. As a result, Utah got bounced in 4 games. The subsequent season was much of the same for both Utah collectively and Kirilenko individually. The Jazz trudged along to 47 wins, and Kirilenko's defensive enthusiasm remained prominent. He averaged 2.2 blocks and 1.5 steals while also setting new career highs in scoring and rebounding. Following that season, both Malone and Stockton decided to retire, leaving the 22-year-old to take command of a ship that was on the verge of sinking. Andrei Kirilenko finally became a full-time starter for Utah in 2003, and that same year, he became the team's go-to option. He thrived in that role and set new benchmarks in every major statistical category, averaging 16.5 points, 8.1 rebounds, 3.1 assists, 2.8 blocks, and 1.9 steals. While Kirilenko didn't have the gaudiest numbers in the league, he was undeniably one of the most well-rounded and versatile forwards in the game. Few players, if any, left their fingerprints on every facet of the game as efficiently as he did, which is evidenced by his multiple 5x5 performances that season, which occurs when a player records at least 5 of every major statistical category: points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals. Throughout NBA history, only 13 players have achieved such a feat. Of those guys, Kirilenko and Hakeem Olajuwon are the only ones to do it multiple times in a season. In fact, they're the only 2 guys to do it multiple times ever. They're the only 2 players in NBA history to have more than one 5x5 game. Kirilenko was so omnipresent that he earned his first and only All-Star nod. Additionally, he landed on the All-Defensive Second Team, finished 4th in the Most Improved Player of the Year voting, finished 5th in the Defensive Player of the Year voting, and even got a couple of MVP votes. With all of that said, I would argue that his most impressive achievement is leading that Utah Jazz team to a 42-40 record. Now, I get it. A 42-40 record is barely above average, but when you look at the roster of this Utah Jazz team, it is a miracle that they finished with more than 30 wins. Their second best player, and no disrespect to any of these guys, but their second best player was Matt Harpring, a 27-year-old forward who appeared in only, let me check my notes, 31 games. Their other option was Gordon Gierczak, who came over halfway through the season from, I believe it was the Orlando Magic? Yes, from the Orlando Magic when the Jazz traded away Deshaun Stevenson. There was a severe talent deficit on that Utah Jazz team, and it was apparent even before the season. The preseason odds makers set Utah's over-under at 25.5. The people making the odds expected the Utah Jazz to be the worst team in the league, and they managed to finish 2 games above 500, largely in part to Andrei Kirilenko's performances. Kirilenko's defensive dominance persisted throughout his 4th season. He, again, proved to be one of the NBA's most disruptive forwards by averaging 1.6 steals per game, and he even managed to lead the league in blocks at 3.3 despite missing half of the season with a wrist injury. As one might expect, Utah's overachieving was impossible without Kirilenko, and the team floundered to just 26 wins that season. But changes were on their way. It's tough to say whether they were good or bad because ultimately it depends on what side of the coin you're looking at it from, but we'll get into that shortly. Carlos Boozer and Mehmet Okur joined the team during the summer of 2004, and the organization drafted Darren Williams with their first-round selection in 2005, forming a big four that had youth and boundless potential. Each one of those players occupied a different role. There was Mehmet Okur, who was a perimeter-minded forward, and Carlos Boozer, who was more of a post-up guy. And then, of course, you had Andrei Kirilenko, who was everywhere on both offense and defense. And then you had Darren Williams, the catalyst of it all. That first season, the 2005-2006 season, featured a 15-win improvement. Of that group, I would say that Kirilenko was the most impactful as he averaged more than 15 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 blocks while also adding 1.5 steals. From there, in what was some of the best basketball Andrei Kirilenko had ever played, his career took a bizarre turn. In this weird twist, Kirilenko had his minutes slashed considerably. There were no signs of wear and tear on Kirilenko's body. He was still just 24 years old, and that injury he had sustained was a freak wrist injury. So it's unknown as to why Jerry Sloan slashed his minutes from almost 38 to less than 30. As a result, Kirilenko was rightfully pissed off, and he went on to post the worst numbers of his career. While Kirilenko's spot in the rotation suddenly changed, Utah went on to pick up 51 wins and met the Houston Rockets in the first round of the playoffs. They narrowly escaped that Houston team before dispatching the Golden State Warriors the following round in 5 games. Andrei Kirilenko was particularly effective in that series against Golden State, averaging 16 points, 9 rebounds, 3.5 assists, and 3.2 blocks. It was one of his patented stat lines that looked that way because his minutes had finally returned to normal at 35.1 to be exact. Following their advancement past Golden State, the Jazz ran into the Spurs and got minced. They got diced like a tomato, and it was really because the entire team played like garbage outside of Carlos Boozer and Darren Williams. For the next 4 seasons, Andrei Kirilenko remained in that spot in the rotation that he hadn't been accustomed to up until that point. During that time, his minutes remained under 30, and even if he didn't like where he was at in the rotation, he had just gotten over and was finally putting up numbers that were similar to what they were at when he was seeing more time. His scoring average returned to double figures, and Kirilenko remained a proficient rebounder and a decent playmaker. He was also still an effective defender, but there was a little bit of regression from the guy who was averaging more than 2.5 blocks a game. They had dropped to below 1.5. After completing the 2010-11 season, Kirilenko returned to CSKA Moscow thanks to the NBA lockout. Any deterioration that we witnessed during his time in the States looked non-existent when he returned to the EuroLeague. Even when the lockout was over, Kirilenko did not return to the States, and it was easy to see why, because his minutes were up, as was his production. In 17 appearances with CSKA Moscow, Kirilenko averaged 14 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 2 blocks, numbers that were good enough for him to be named the EuroLeague MVP. Being just 30 years old, Kirilenko was relatively young and appeared to have some stuff left in the tank. As a result, he signed a 2-year deal with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Although Minnesota was ass at the time, Kirilenko was one of the team's better players. He finished 3rd in scoring and rebounding and 2nd in steals and blocks. That offseason, Kirilenko declined the 2nd year of his contract with Minnesota and went on to sign with the Brooklyn Nets. In total, he would spend 2 years with the team, but he only suited up for 52 games. And it was at that point that he felt he was no longer able to contribute anything, and he would hang it up from professional basketball, both in the NBA and with the Russian national team. And Andrei Kirilenko officially announced his retirement in June of 2015. Thank you guys so very much for coming to hang out with me today. If this is your first time, welcome. If you are a returning viewer or a returning listener, welcome back. You can find everything that I'm associated with down in the description. That's social medias. That's the podcast that I host that is available on Apple, Spotify, basically wherever you get your podcast. If you liked the video, go ahead and leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike, leave a comment below. Just let me know your thoughts about everything, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. As always, I'm grateful for any support, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.